The word clinical trial it describes a way of testing medicines on people in a way that proves to everybody, scientists, the world, other patients, the government, people who run the laws and so on, to prove to all of those people that the medicine we want is safe and will actually have an effect on the condition we're trying to treat. So that's what a clinical trial is. And the reason it has to be like that is because for centuries before clinical trials, people have been using medicines and then promising everyone that they work. And you had nothing really to go on except the word of the person that you were speaking to, or maybe the fact that someone else felt that they got better on something that that person had given them. So they could literally come around and give you any kind of medicine and claim that it worked. And you were just at the mercy of those people and had to sort of accept it or not. Now we won't let a medicine be sold or given to people unless we're sure that it works, because we know from the past that giving medicines that don't work can actually have the opposite effect in that it can harm people. So placebo is a big one. You might find your child being called as a participant because people who enroll in a clinical trial that are not patients because we're not treating them, therefore they are participants. They talk about enrolling. That's the process of getting you to sign up for the clinical trial. Informed consent is the process of actually giving permission for the trial. So there could be the notion of being blinded, a double blind, or placebo-controlled, or randomized controlled. Some of the other words that you might encounter are investigator. That's the new name that they give to the doctor who's busy doing the study. That doctor might be the doctor who cares for you all the time, but in terms of the study, he's then the investigator. You might also hear the word sponsor. Sponsor is the company that's making the drug, that is funding the development of the drug, giving the money so that the study can be done. That's called the sponsor. And then you might see words like IRB. That means Internal Review Board. In America and Canada, I think that's where that term is used. In South Africa or other countries in Europe, it would be called the Ethics Committee. This is a group of people who sit and look through the trial and make sure that there's no undue risk to participants, that the investigators are qualified to be doing what they are doing, that they will not do anything untoward, and that the participants are protected at all times. So the placebo effect is the reason why people would sometimes think a snake oil or some beeswax or honey and some other constituent could be used as a medicine, because we have this situation in people that when a doctor prescribes something, oftentimes people feel better just because, for a number of reasons, they feel the doctor is caring for them. They feel finally someone is doing something. They start checking their own bodies and sort of wondering, hang on, do I really feel better? And then sort of convincing themselves that they might feel better. There are 1,000 reasons why people feel better, even if they get something that doesn't actually fix their problem. And we've been able to measure this effect for years in studies, where you can see that people are reporting that they feel better on a medicine, even though they're getting something which has no medicine in it. And we can measure that, and we know that it's around 20-30% of people feel better regardless of what you give them. So to counterbalance all of that stuff, we need to be able to do a test where we take the active drug, the medicine that we want to use, the thing that we're trying to decide, is it safe and is it effective? And we have to compare it to giving nothing. And we have to have the doctor and the patient believe that even though there's nothing in this other tablet, that might be the medicine. That's called a double-blind, randomized controlled clinical trial. So double-blind means the doctor doesn't know which medicine the patient is getting, and the patient doesn't know what medicine they're getting. And also the patients are randomly divided between getting the medicine or getting the placebo. And the reasons for that are good, because we as doctors are just humans as well. We also want our patients to feel better. And the reason we need to be blinded is so that we don't let slip to the patient, oh, don't worry, you're going to get a lot better, because we really want our patients to get better. We want to help them. So on the one hand, we might give away to the patient that they've gotten the active drug just through our behavior, not necessarily saying anything, just smiling at them the whole time because we're so happy they're getting the drug or something like that. So we need to not know either. We have to build in that security into the system that the doctor doesn't know who's being treated with what, and the patient doesn't know who's treated with what. So that's called a randomized controlled clinical trial. Usually you have the placebo group and the treatment group, the active arm. And sometimes the trial is such that you will get enrolled and randomized, and there'll be these two groups. And then at the end of the study, you might find that the people on the active treatment did well. The study is designed that way. The people in the placebo group won't get anything. Many studies now have a crossover, so that the placebo group, especially in rare diseases, that the people in the placebo group will eventually join the active group. But in some trials, as you suggest, if you're in the placebo group, you might just be in the placebo group, and that might be the end of it, which is not, necessarily what people want. But what people need to understand about clinical trials is they're not being done so that we treat people. We first have to decide, is it a valid treatment? And we can never get to that point if we don't have placebo-controlled trials, because there'll always be a question about whether something is effective unless we've actually done a placebo-controlled trial. So if you're a patient with a rare condition, you might end up in the placebo group, but if that drug gets approved, then you might get access to that drug. And so you might not personally benefit immediately in that trial, but you might be benefiting later on, or you might be benefiting people who are not born yet, who only one day will be diagnosed with FOP. But the key thing is that you need to understand also that not only might you not get the treatment, but actually there are clinical trials, and this is why we do clinical trials, where the medicine actually has harmful effects. And you might be one of the people who are lucky enough to get the medicine, but then get a harmful effect from the medicine. And then you would have been better off in the placebo group. So it is an experiment, and there's no way getting away from that. Clinical trial is not a treatment. A clinical trial is a step in the direction of a treatment. There may be benefits if you participate in the trial, but there may be harm. And you may end up on placebo, in which case, hopefully nothing happens to you. So people have to be very clear in their minds. This is not a miracle treatment that's happening. It's an experiment to see whether medicine will work or not. It's an essential part of getting a medicine eventually. But people just have to understand it's a service that you do to society, participating in a clinical trial. You should probably consider it in a way that it's something that you're doing for the community rather than something you're doing for yourself. In a good clinical trial, what's expected is that, first of all, your doctor would tell you that, look, we've got this clinical trial and we want you to consider taking part. What the doctors shouldn't do is tell you that you're going to be treated for your condition, because if it's a randomized controlled clinical trial, as I've just explained, you might actually not get the medicine that you're hoping to get as part of the treatment. So the doctor needs to explain all of that to you extremely carefully. So you need to go through a long consent process where the amount of detail is actually a little overwhelming. So you have to go through all of that, and it is the responsibility of the doctor to make sure that everything that's in the consent form, which is the consent form is where you sign or give permission that you want to take part in the clinical trial. But you have to know every single fact about the clinical trial, including what are the possible side effects, what are the side effects that have been seen in animals. Usually we start with testing in animals, and then we go to healthy humans, and then we go just to some adults with a condition, and then we go to big groups of people with a condition. Those are sort of the stages 1, 2, 3 of clinical trials. And during all of those phases, we're monitoring the drug to see if there are side effects. And all of that information needs to be shared with you at your consent process. So the consent is really the beginning of getting you into a clinical trial. At that point, you will understand exactly when you're supposed to come, what you're supposed to do, when you're allowed to leave the trial, which is any time you like, and what the expectations are in terms of you getting better, whether there's a placebo arm in the trial. Some trials don't have a placebo arm, whether there's the possibility that you get placebo in the beginning, and sometimes they then switch over, and then some people get placebo and then the active drug. You need to understand all of those things before you can even begin to take part in a clinical trial. And all of this has to be very carefully documented so that the people who regulate clinical trials, this is governments and regulatory authorities, they want to know, they want to check up on the doctor who's done the clinical trial to make sure that you've had the consent form for a long enough time, that the discussion was clear. They want us to document the questions that you ask. It's quite an extensive process just to go through the consent procedure, but that permission to take part in a clinical trial is absolutely critical, because it's impossible and it's not right to do clinical trials on people or test anything on people if you don't tell them exactly what is expected and what's going to happen during the clinical trial. It's not as simple as, I want to be in a clinical trial, let me start. Usually these things are very finely controlled and they only want the groups to be the same. So we want the placebo group and the people getting the medicine to be absolutely the same, because it doesn't help if we give the placebo and we give the medicine, but the two groups were so different that the one feels better anyway, because they're actually a different group of patients, because they might be younger or they might be healthier or they might, not have other problems. So we need to make sure the groups are balanced and that they're the same. So for that, there have to be very strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, which inclusion means the reasons why you can be in the trial or the things that you need to be able to be in the trial, and exclusion criteria are the things that you can't have. If you have those, then you can't be in the trial. For instance, if you are expecting a baby, you can't be in a clinical trial, because we don't want to give a medicine to someone who might be expecting a baby, because we don't want to harm the baby. If there's something that the medicine can potentially do to the person or the baby, then that's absolutely forbidden. So most clinical trials will have that as an exclusion. An inclusion criteria might be, you have FOP, but you're only between 12 and 18 years old, for instance, because we don't want to give it to young children yet. We want to see how it does in older children and adults. We're trying to, the biggest risk is in the youngest of the young. So we try and protect the youngest children for as long as we can. Eventually the study might go there. But for this study, for example, we don't want young children. We want children who are already mostly grown, for instance, to be in the clinical trials. And so there are long lists of these things. You get blood tests, you can't be on other treatments, et cetera, that determine. So that way you make sure that the two groups are exactly the same. Then once you've got those two exactly the same groups, then you'll be enrolled in the trial. That first day when you sign, that's usually called screening. At that point, you're signing the consent form and doing some basic tests to make sure you can get into the trial. Then usually a baseline visit would be scheduled, which is your first visit, where you might then get more tests, more scans, but you might also you probably will start getting the medicine, whether it's placebo or whether it's the active medicine. And then there'll be a schedule of visits to which you have to stick very carefully until the trial is finished. If at any stage during the trial you become sick, all of that needs to be reported, and the doctor and you have to make a decision on whether you think it might be the medicine that's actually made this thing happen or whether you think it might be something else. And then at the end of the trial, those two groups are compared. The bad effects, remember, even the people in the placebo group can have bad effects. They might get a stomach bug and get diarrhea, and so might the people in the treatment group. And so we compare who's got the most, and then we can see the relative safety of this medicine compared to placebo. At the end of all that, most trials will then either have an extension so that you can stay on the medicine if you've been getting better. So they want to look at long-term safety, or if they're convinced that it's long-term safe and it's working for you, in most trials, there'll be an expectation from the regulatory authorities that you'd be allowed to continue on that medicine as long as it benefits you. Of course, at any stage during a clinical trial, the person being studied can say, I don't want to be part of this anymore for whatever reason. And you're not allowed to be pressurized into doing a clinical trial or to stay in a clinical trial, nor are you allowed to be paid to take part in a clinical trial or to be paid to stay in a clinical trial. You might be paid for your expenses on the day, and that has to happen. We can't expect you to have to pay to come to do something that's essentially an experiment. We have to pay for that. But we also can't pay too much, because we don't want to make you feel like you're doing this for money, because that's the wrong reason to do it. And then you might place yourself in harm's way. An ethics board must approve any trial. And then we, as the investigators, according to good clinical practice, have to report back to the ethics or the IRB any side effects on the trial that we see, and we also have to report back anyway every 6 months to tell them how many people on the clinical trial, etc. They keep a very close eye on how things are going with a view to protecting all of us, but especially the patient. It is important that you ask questions, that you don't enter a clinical trial with a nagging doubt in your mind. That's very important, that you don't go into a trial wondering about anything, A. And B, the doctor, the investigator might actually like you to ask questions because it shows him that you understand everything that is said. You should ask, can I stop the trial anytime? What are the inclusion and exclusion criteria? What are the potential harms? What's the medicine that's been given? Nowadays in clinical trials, you should also ask, how much blood are you going to be taking? Are you going to be doing anything that's a painful procedure, taking blood, etc.? For instance, if you're getting scans and so on, you need to understand all of that, and all those risks need to be explained to you. And then you need to ask questions around, what are the potential side effects of the medicine I'm taking and why do you think it might work? If someone's telling you there are no side effects at all, I can guarantee you a result with no side effects. That's like someone coming to you with an investment saying you're going to make 500%, no risk of losing your money. It's just not going to happen. That's just not the way the world's put together. If someone asks me to participate in a clinical trial, I'll have 1,000 questions, and I must ask them. And so must, even more so, a mother bringing a child to a clinical trial should have a question, even if it feels like a stupid question. It's the right question to ask because there can be no doubt in the room. The air must be clear. We must go into this thing knowing exactly what is expected and what are the potential effects on a child, our most precious members of our family. So you have to ask the questions, and the doctor wants you to ask them. Some medicines you absolutely can't take. You certainly can't take another medicine that treats the condition that's being studied. You can't be taking two things that try and do the same thing. If you do, you're welcome to, but then you need to tell the clinical trial, and then the trial will stop for you if that's one of the medicines that's not allowed in the clinical trial. But often during a clinical trial, there are medicines that you would be allowed to take. For instance, in an FOP trial, most FOP trials would allow you to carry on with some of the other standard therapies that are used because, to be fair, they don't really impact on the disease that much. But some clinical trials in FOP, for instance, will allow you to use steroids and keep you in the trial. In some trials, if you take something that might interfere so much with what's being studied that we now can't say whether it's the original, the thing we're studying that makes the difference, or the medicine that you've just taken as an additive that's having the effect. And the same thing can also be said for side effects. The more medicines you take, the more we don't know if it's that medicine that's causing the side effect or the medicine that we're testing. So usually there are very clear guidelines on what you can and what you can't take in a clinical trial. But every single thing you take in a clinical trial, you have to discuss with your doctor. Certainly many countries in the world, most I would say, have a rule that the clinical trial, unless under very specific circumstances, should allow you to continue with medicine if it's working for you until that medicine is registered in your country. It's not a good practice to study a medicine on someone and then at the end of the study say, you can't have it anymore, and then expect them just to be able to buy it or something like that. You need to be able to make sure that this person who's actually sacrificed of themselves to take part in this clinical trial gets the benefit of the treatment going forward. So a bad clinical trial is the doctor gives you a consent, which is a half a page long, and it doesn't tell you what's in there, it just says sign there. Or he says, you can take part in my clinical trial, but you have to pay for the visits, or you have to pay for the medicine, you have to pay for some part of the clinical trial. That's not good. If the doctor says to you, I'm testing a new medicine, what's in there is a secret, that's a very bad clinical trial because you have no idea what the potential risks are. And he'll say, don't worry, it's fine. He or she, that's a bad clinical trial. A clinical trial should give you a lot of information to the point where most people actually feel a little overwhelmed and exhausted at the end of it. But that is an essential part of a clinical trial. If someone's glossing over details and saying sign here, sign there, they either don't have a good clinical trial or they're doing it badly. And all doctors who do clinical trials have to undergo a form of training we call good clinical practice, which is a set of rules by which we all have to work to make sure that we conduct these trials in a way that protects the person enrolled. That's the most important person in the trial. A bad clinical trial will have several pointers towards the fact that some of these steps are being glossed over or ignored. Another thing that a bad trial is, trust me, come on this trial, I guarantee you 100% you'll get better. That's just not how clinical trials work. The reason we do them is we hope you get better, but we can't say for sure. But if someone's promising you a result in a clinical trial, that's just a very big danger sign. That just really rings alarm bells. Doctor must give you a very sober picture of what's going on. And he has to explain why he thinks that medicine will work in you. What makes you think this medicine will work is what you have to ask the doctor.